Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Sales Transformation Podcast. And I'm really delighted this time to invite Dr. Jas Ardis onto the podcast. And I just want to say a few words about how we met because we were both at graduation, sitting waiting for the doctorate graduation, and I'd never met Jas before, and we're sitting next to each other, and I sort of whispered over to my left, and what was your dissertation? What did you do your dissertation on? And um, and Jas said something to do with a title that he couldn't really talk about in public, which got me intrigued. And I'm just going to ask Jas to see if he can remember what the title was of his dissertation. And I'm afraid my title was quite long as well. But Jas, can you remember roughly what the title was of your dissertation?
Yes, it was strategic intelligence operations.
I thought it was a bit more complicated than that. I thought it was to do with sort of counterintelligence and something else sort of weaved into it as well. But yeah, okay. But it was as short as that, was it?
But it was a short when they gave me that wonderful piece of paper. It had intelligence and deception operations.
Ah,
Uh, you know, Phillips, how long it takes you to figure out the actual topic you're working on. So it took me until the actual point of graduation to make that determination.
well, very good. Well, you can imagine that, it's the first time we met. We'd had this very brief conversation. Then we met up for drinks afterwards, and it was a very stimulating conversation because in the short amount of time that we had then at graduation, began to sort of get some insights into the kind of interesting world of intelligence and how intelligence is used and managed in different theaters, if you like. And so I think it's probably best at this stage for me to hand over to Jas to give us a bit more context into who he is and what his life has been a commitment to. And then we'll then move into some other sort of more detailed discussions about some of the approaches that he takes when looking at intelligence and information and how to manage information. So, Jas, over to you.
Well, thanks very much. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to chat with you, colleagues and students and so forth. Like you say, we've known each other for a long time, and a lot's happened to both of us during that period of time, and we've both advanced in our professions and reflected on, I think, more and more the similarities between the government intelligence community and the area of business and business intelligence as well. So my background, both my father and mother were involved in psychiatry. My father was a psychiatrist, my mother's a psychologist, and I was brought up in a house with books by Eric Byrne and people like that, the chap that wrote. So I was exposed to the issue of thinking well or thinking badly, or I guess cognitive pathologies as well, fairly early. And I think that early exposure allows me a bit of a head start in terms of thinking about how the human interacted both with each other, but also with the outside world, and more recently with technologies and so forth. So that was my that was the mold. For one reason or another, I ended up moving into the world of music for a decade or so when I was a teenager. It seemed like a very good idea at the time, and it was certainly very enjoyable. Then to skip that in my CV because there was an awful lot of.
Are you a sort of are you a sort of unknown rock star? If we look back into your, will we see you on stage, sort of beating the drums or playing the guitar?
There are sort of some strands of evidence of my involvement in the community. I mean, at one point, technically, the band I was in supported Simple Minds.
Okay.
Point out that it was a 2-day festival. We were the first band on at the bottom of the billing, and Simple Minds, obviously, 48 hours later, were at the top.
Okay.
So, yeah.
That's great, though.
it was fun. It was I think a good thing to do when you're younger.
Yes.
Of course, um, music is something that does require some innovation and thinking, and there's a few things that cropped up when I was working with other musicians that struck me as interesting, and that have actually turned out to be relatively transportable to later problems in life. Um, that included trying to come up with a new tune, for example. Now, there's only 12 notes in an octave, and there's all sorts of combinations, and most people who are involved in the music industry were significantly better than I was at coming up with new ideas. But one of the things we thought about was a lost wax method way of generating music. When you listen to the music you like very much, and then you come up in your head with something which you can play along with it. Then you only play the bits that you just thought of that accompany the original music,
Yeah.
uh, with something that counterpoints that. So the element that is the final counterpoint, whilst it is technically derived from the music someone else wrote, it's entirely your own. So we have used variations of this method to come up with innovative designs for and approaches and tactics, which are innovative, but which have an original seed. So that was
Okay.
one of the interesting way of coming up with new ideas. And of course, if you get a few people who are different but have some commonality, if you get them together, they tend to work very well with a process like that, and you can come up with all sorts of unexpected stuff. So, emergent properties,
Yeah.
as I the thing that was the first indication of something usefully emergent.
Okay.
Um, so anyway, after music, I set up a small business with a colleague, and we did some surface mount electronics, which we did very limited manufacturing, but that was interesting because we were dealing with buying from a supply chain, selling to various clients, but also having to manage production and so forth. And the logistics of all of that with two people was quite a challenge. Um, and I think that was probably um, arguably, as a musician, I was selling something. I mean, if you play dances, then you failed your customer, you don't get invited back. But in business, we were certainly dealing with quite a complex supply chain and thinking of a variety of clients that we had and potential clients as well. No, my colleague that I was in business with went off and got married and got a proper grown-up job after that. So that's the point I went to university to do my first degree, which was computational physics. And there was a lot of modeling of complex systems there. And I admit that when I did go to university, I really went. I wanted to get a job afterwards, but I also wanted to answer some fundamental questions about the
Mhm.
world. And curiously, within 6 months of the first year at York, I was with my fellow students asking questions that none of the lecturers could answer.
Right.
Um, you know, what happened before the Big Bang, and how can a wave travel through a vacuum, and so forth, and what a quark's made of. So, whilst it didn't um, provide me with the answers I was expecting, it gave me other benefits instead. Um, and that gave me a reasonable basis for moving into more formal employment thereafter. Um, so after graduating from York, I moved into the Ministry of Defence, um, and I was there for some time, working with all three services, including on the strategic deterrent. Um, and I think there's some ideas that came out of there, which have also stayed with me. Principally, um, what was curious was at times it was very difficult to tell the difference between offense and defense. Without wanting to go into too much detail, just for the sake of not boring those listeners, uh, when you think somebody might attack you, if you take measures to protect yourself, the person thinking of attacking you may interpret those as offensive.
Yeah.
Um, so there's very much a perspective dependent view on the whole thing. Um, and I think when you start dealing with multiple stakeholders in a situation which is competitive, it gets very complicated very quickly. So one of the things that the Ministry of Defence became keen on developing around that time was the capability to um, influence populations and other states and so forth in order to try to achieve a good outcome. And that was something I was involved in for a while. And I noticed while reading your book, Phil, that when um, you talk about confirmation bias. I think you give it a different name, actually. Maybe um, auto
Also,
bio.
ethical, yeah, listening, and yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, we do talk about that a lot, and I think we can come back to that. But I think what was really quite interesting as I got sort of to know you is the sort of topics we're beginning to talk about kind of now, and it's looking at how you might look at information um, in the world in which you're operating in, sort of making the connections, with the sales profession.
mm,
And
yeah,
I think that I've always felt, and I still feel very strongly that there's uh, a layer of critical thinking that could be very interesting to learn more about in the sales world, um, that probably we haven't yet achieved. um, because the way in which I began to see some insights into the sort of things that you were doing and the
mm,
sort of modeling that you were doing, the degree of questioning that you were doing, I felt could be a really, really useful kind of link to the world of sales. And we can go into that perhaps in a bit more detail.
mm,
But I want to also just say, for the benefit of the listeners, is that from the early discussions with Jazz, where we began to understand each other's professions, we did invite Jazz to come to a GST event some years ago now. And I remember you sort of having the whole audience in stitches with some of the, I think you came up with an image of a giraffe, and I can't quite connect what you communicate with the
it
giraffe.
was.
You can maybe fill me in now as to what the connection was.
Yes, if I recall correctly, and not many of my presentations do start off with a giraffe and a tree, but and intended to illustrate was the fact that I had been have quite a playful relationship with my young daughter, and I was always telling her silly things and making her laugh. And I realised that, of course, from her point of view, if I told her um, a whole bunch of daft things which weren't true, but were nevertheless amusing. When I needed to tell her something that was true, I kind of preconditioned her not to believe what I was saying. And I remember finding out from a friend of mine who was a very expert biologist, and I think I've got this right. Apparently, giraffes can't cough. A bunch of facts that occurred at the same. Unfortunately, I can't remember them, but this one for some reason stuck in my mind. Um, so I told my daughter this, and of course she just assumed I was taking the mickey and saying something that wasn't true. Um, and she said, right, something along the lines of, well, next you're going to tell me that they can't climb trees. Of course, I went to try to find a giraffe up a tree, and eventually I managed to find one. So I think the point I was making at the GST event was that it's if you have um, if you say things that aren't true or you exaggerate too much, it's a little bit like crying wolf. When you really want somebody to believe you, you have to be quite careful. So, in terms of the MOD, um, we have, or we had, and I'm no longer a member of them, very strict rules on what you can communicate with the outside world, which is quite sensible. Some of the people that we were working alongside with, for example, other states who were uh, communicating with their populations, were less constrained by the need actually to say things that were true. And so, whilst you're trying to form a cooperative relationship, at that level, it was very difficult if the people we were working with were very hyperbolic and tended to exaggerate everything and say things that seemed to be convenient at the time. So the stage we were working with might gain a short-term win by saying something that suited them, but
Yeah.
in the long, they were actually paying for that significantly more,
Yeah.
and the disadvantage can hugely outweigh the advantage that they'd gained in the so. And this brought me back to thinking about intelligence and deception and the risks of using deception. Now, I'm not ruling it out entirely. It has its place,
Yeah.
but I think deception, telling lies, exaggerating, and so forth, it's not really a good long-term sustainable strategy. Of course, if you're thinking about sales, it would definitely be a mistake to think of each opportunity to sell as an individual and independent event.
Yeah.
You think about how you behave and what you do during that event, how that's seen in the longer term, what effect it'll have downstream and so forth. So the need to develop trusted partnerships with people is much more important than gaining a short-term win.
Yeah.
So I think that's the very long story about why we started the presentation with a giraffe up a tree.
It is, but actually, as you're speaking, I mean, there's so many sort of correlations, I think, between what you've just said and, of course, sales. And we have, what is the source of the truth? Because the deception can work both from the buyer side. It doesn't have to be the
Mm.
seller side, and you sort of get involved sometimes in games that are kind of being played as two parties are sort of coming together towards some sort of negotiated settlement, and um, and so you can see the strategies that you can sense the strategies that you can both adopt yourself as a sales team wanting to win, let's say, a very important deal. How do you best communicate your strengths? And maybe, it's never a good thing. We never say in sales it's good to deride your competition. You never knock your competition.
Mm.
Yeah, but there are ways in which you may present certain aspects of what you do that kind of imply that maybe an argument or a product or a service you're competing with is not quite up to scratch. For example, you might say words like, from my experience, a lot of people have said this about A. So you haven't said it about A, but someone is other customers have said it about something. So you might not be knocking them, but the way in which you construct phrases and the way in which you um, put those in sometimes dialogue, sometimes in letters, sometimes in proposals, those subtle nuances is a game being played by all the parties in trying to win a deal. And of course, from the other side, you're going to get the same playback back from customers.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, I think you're right about it being like a series of roles, and people, in a sense, following scripts which have a clear left and right of arc, and some things are not allowed for good reason. And as you say, knocking the competition is, it may make you feel as if you're gaining a short-term benefit, but it's not a good strategy. I think also that, and you mentioned that buyers as well as sellers have biases and
Yeah,
and so forth. And I'm aware, when I was acting as a buyer for the MOD, we would occasionally say things which, whilst literally inoffensive, were quite a clear warning that somebody was kind of straying a bit too near the perimeter of what was allowable.
right.
But we had to make sure that if we were audited, everything was fine, and we were being commercially fair and open and all of this.
Yeah,
So, I mean, I think it's okay to say that, if you're a buyer, sometimes it's okay to take some of the sellers, to hold some of the sellers' feet a little close to the fire.
yeah,
That's It's a situation where you have essentially one buyer and multiple stakeholders, sort of multiple suppliers. Um, but I think also quite often the buyers make the mistake of thinking that there's some kind of implicit other relationship.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the buyer likes to take a dominant role,
Yeah.
which they're able to do because of their commercial leverage, but which doesn't really do them good either. And it also can prevent the supplier from having essentially an adult to adult relationship with the buyer. So it becomes more like a parent child from the buyer to the seller.
Yes.
Um, so we've seen this not work. And I think many of the things I've learned within the MOD and working with government thereafter have indicated really, really good examples of how not to do things. And so a few good examples of how to do things well, but the examples of how not to do things far outweigh the good examples I've seen. And so far as I've seen, no one yet has really managed to crack the challenge of having a supplier client relationship, which is truly on a peer-to-peer level, where you are exchanging information in order to achieve a mutually beneficial outcome. There's always some other element in there which causes a problem.
Yeah. It's quite, yeah, it's quite interesting because we talk about the tension of, of being too client centric, because of course you've got to act in the interest of your own company as well.
Mm.
And so when we talk about the positive and negative values, is the basis of my dissertation, there's always a line that you need to be conscious of, which is, yes, you need to do whatever you can to benefit the customer, but you need to remember also that you're in business
Yeah.
to make a profit, to succeed, and to win. And the ethical tension that you sometimes have between those two pulling kind of influences
Mm.
is something that needs to be managed. And I think you talk about the ethics of exaggeration. I think you mentioned that in sort of conversation that we've had as well, which is
Yeah.
quite interesting. We've On our master's programs, we do talk about ethics, but I don't think we've ever talked about ethics of exaggeration. And I think that's a really interesting one. You've
There
obviously
is.
spent some time thinking about it. So tell me
Yeah.
more. Yeah.
I wrote a white paper recently on disinformation, and for the record, my colleagues and I try to go with HNG's view, which is that disinformation is deliberate spreading of wrongful information, false information. Misinformation is the accidental dissemination of wrongful information, and then there's telling the truth, which is fine. Um, while I was writing about disinformation, there was a whole series of steps of disinformation, all of them intentional,
Yeah.
but from mild exaggeration all the way up to a downright malicious lie. And so there was very much a spectrum of it there. And certain forms of exaggeration, like saying I'm starving. That's not true, and you're deliberately saying that, and you probably know that you're not starving. You're just mildly hungry.
Yeah.
Uh, Nobody would really call that disinformation because it's not malicious. It's just a mild exaggeration for effect. Um, but you've started on the spectrum, and if you do go all the way up, then you get to the kind of highly manipulative and very, very dangerous use of information in order to generate significant problems, which is clearly unethical. So
Yeah.
at some point, being mildly exaggerating and telling an outright lie in order to cause problems, there's a kind of ethical threshold where it's okay up to a point, and then it becomes perhaps a bit questionable, and after that, it's really not. It's
Yeah.
just um, it's specious or just simply wrong. Kind of puts the people who then have to deliver on the spot because they've been kind of um, uh,
What,
with the,
promising something that can't be delivered?
yeah, exactly, exactly.
Okay.
So it may secure the contract, but then you've still got a kind of a residual problem. So I think that's something that again, we have to be careful of, and we have to understand not so much what we say, but how it's heard. And that also is touched on in your excellent book, which I fully endorse.
Thank you.
It is to do. There's as many perspectives as in the room as there are people.
Yeah.
I think people tend to forget that, and certainly, again, with the ministry, when we were dealing with populations and states, you've got to think about the culture first of all, and their predispositions and heuristics and biases.
Yeah.
Um, and there's a lot of examples of how it hasn't worked, and a few where it's been really, really good. But it's no different in sales, because you have competitors and you have an objective.
Yeah.
Try to achieve your objective at least occasionally, um, but you have to leave yourself, after you've achieved that objective, with the possibility of being successful again in the future. So you don't want to trade off too much for the long term potential versus benefits.
Um, so would you kind of, I don't know how much too much thought goes into the kind of communication strategy that might go alongside a sales campaign, apart from securing meetings with key people, and we need to put a proposal together to it, it, um I mean, yeah, to present our solution. I'm not sure how much attention is sort of, or thought is given to the science of communication as you're going through that process.
Mm,
Maybe for the smaller deals, it's not so important. And your marketing department may be sort of handling quite a lot of the marketing noise that goes out there.
mm.
But would you advocate then for people involved in more complex sales solutions that they could benefit in some way from this whole topic of um, how we communicate, the dissemination of information,
Yeah,
and taking that into not just your domain, but the competitors that you might be up against?
absolutely. I mean, um, I think it's essential, obviously, to understand your competitors. The phrase "know your enemy" comes to mind. You've got to understand how the world is seen by the client, and the client, of course, is not always one person. As you said in the book, quite often the decision about go no go for a particular potential contract may be vested in quite a few people. And of course, those people have different backgrounds, different perspectives, different biases, different experiences, and some of them may be full time, some of them may be part time, and they may not communicate with each other in a completely rational fashion. So that's a bit of a movable feast. And of course, there will always be some uncertainty associated with that, not least of which some of them may have short term memory loss. So you can't be sure that if you
Yeah.
said something to a group, then that's persisted.
Yeah.
So, and I think you also need to recognize that the way decisions are made is not utilitarian. Um, so Klein and others have done some excellent work on how decisions are actually made. And I think that's something which is obviously a huge topic. But if you were narrowed down into the sales topic of how is one competitor selected out of several,
Yes.
it really done? I know that's the kind of research that you've done, but maybe it's looking at through the other end of the pipe. So because in my experience, I think the decision about how to award a contract has been qualitative but dressed up as quantitative.
Right.
So people tend to attribute percentages to this, that, the
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
degree, and so forth, and looking at compliance matrices and statements of work and so forth. And a lot of that is a checkbox exercise. Um, but it's very error prone. And people, whilst they may say, I think this is 70% good, they're frankly working that number out of the ether.
Yeah.
Uh, comes from how they feel about things. So again, having an adult relationship with your clients is supremely valuable,
Yeah.
a lot easier for everyone. And contrary to how I think some salespersons have behaved in the past, taking a submissive or subservient role to the client is actually really annoying to the client many
Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
And saying that, for example, if I was selling to you and I said, I'm not trying to make money from me, I'm trying to solve a problem for you because I care about you far more than I care about me.
Yeah.
No, that's not true. And
Yeah.
again, whilst it may seem to be helpful in exhibiting submission, it actually plays against the seller very much because, um, frankly, I think that people don't like people who are like that.
Yeah.
And then an emotive issue,
Yeah.
that's a really difficult obstacle to overcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe we've all in the past seen some pretty terrible examples of selling, particularly in things like the second-hand car market, where somebody in a sheepskin coat and a flat cap would say, "Trust me, I want the best for you. I've got this brilliant car over here. It's perfect. One careful lady owner,"
Mm.
and this trotting out the spiel. I recently had some builders in who insisted that they wanted to build this fantastic building for me because they wanted to do a personal favour for me and they liked me so much.
Okay.
Uh, Losing money on the contract, but they wanted to carry on because they liked me so much.
Yeah.
Um, it's not believable. It doesn't help. It got my hackles up, and I replaced them with different builders. And I think that we probably need to throw out some old ideas before we bring some new ideas in.
Yeah.
And is that if you are very submissive, that's helpful. It's not. It's actually quite irritating.
So, in terms of the, is it in terms of the, the way you approach problems or opportunities or whatever, because and is there a sort of structure that you kind of use, when you're beginning to look at sort of analyzing problems or situations, and
Sure. Yeah.
could you
Uh,
give me just an overview of how you start to critically reflect, if you like, or on a particular problem and how that influences an outcome potentially?
I think one of the things that we've used a lot is soft systems methodology, which was designed by Chetland and others at Lancaster, I believe. That's a way of looking at complex problem solving, which allows for multiple points of view and even disagreements and so forth. So
Right.
it can break SSM, soft systems methodology, down into a series of steps. I won't go into that now, but anybody who's listening can look it up. Have a The great thing about SSM is that you can adapt it to prevailing circumstances. So I've used versions of SSM quite a lot, particularly within the intelligence community in the broadest sense, because it allows you to identify all the people who are involved and get whatever information you can from them, and then develop root definitions and so forth, and then work through to something which is as good as it can be. So SSM allows you to have structure. I would say that in the sales area, one of the key elements of an approach like that would be to do an information environment analysis.
Right.
Uh, this activity, this analysis, is based on looking at, again, who's involved, what they know, what they like, what they've seen up to this point, and what they would like generally in the future, and so forth. So um, we can account for cultural influences and bias and heuristics, but that will mean that you don't systematically miss out any of the influential factors in the client's and others' decision-making processes. So information environment analysis
Okay.
um, is it's useful. I guess when you do it, you probably never feel it's fully complete because it can't really be
Yeah.
comprehensive. But it's a good way to catch information.
Yeah.
Of course, we've all taken different paths, so we've all got different experiences and insights, and we've all been to different meetings with people. So there's a lot of, in a sense, corporate knowledge probably that you could capture in an IEA, by bringing the right people in who are
Yeah.
experienced with clients and others, and people who know the clients, and allow them to speak uninterrupted and put their rich information into this system. It's a really good way to capture all of that knowledge
Yeah.
that not making the same mistake again and again. So the IEA is essential. Um,
Do you have a point of view of technology and the use of AI at all in helping sort of look at information and maybe you can talk through what you think works well with it and what doesn't work well with AI as well.
I mean, AI has been around for some decades now. I think it started probably around the 60s or something like that. Um, Nevertheless, its proliferation recently has spread out. So there has been so much proliferation recently that the AI products still seem curiously immature.
Yeah.
So I'm sure we've all read a bit of text and thought, right, okay, that's written by AI. It has a kind of signature feel to it, and it's useful at um, testing a lot of information very quickly. And there has been some interesting mathematical problems which have been solved in a matter of a couple of days. AI that have defeated humans for multiple decades, possibly centuries. So it's capable of doing some amazing things in terms of medical diagnostics, image recognition, and so forth, and summarizing huge databases and drawing out what appear to be the salient points. So my qualification with it is that anybody that's used AI knows that sometimes it hallucinates and comes up with which are simply untrue. But because it's an opaque system, you can't work out how what it took as input has led to an output.
Yeah.
When you look at the output, which is the only feasible thing you can do because the input's usually too large,
Yeah.
you can't if the output is actually reliable. So for non-critical processes, AI can be hugely helpful. For critical processes, um, I think people rightly have some degree of trepidation about committing to an AI summary of a very complex series of databases, for example, if it's mission critical or safety critical. So I think for sales, it does definitely have application because there's so much information that we can account for, but there's simply not enough time to assimilate the information. So my understanding is that currently the human race has got something of the order of 460 exabytes of information, and it's increasing that by something like 15 petabytes per second, which is massive.
Right.
Um, so all of the information is there. And the problem we used to have in the intelligence community, for example, was that there wasn't much information, but there was a whole bunch of analysts sitting around uh, waiting for something to come in that could be useful in order they'd pass it on to somebody who could make a decision about it. Since the information revolution, there's so much information that the analysts simply can't, they have a problem with figuring out what to select, never mind analyze.
Right.
Of course, this is growing hugely for all of the time. So the problem now, of course, is that it's you have to figure out what's worth looking at, um, and there is no deterministic solution to that selection. So if we can find a way in sales to queue an AI system, then we probably would be on a winner. I do feel very positive about it because I think that the intuition and experience that we have within the sales community will allow us to do that. But there isn't the capacity for those people themselves to analyze the information.
Right.
And if we're a bit wrong now and again, it's not safety critical, and it will probably be picked up by the human. So if we can access the information um, through conventional means and have a few AI systems processing it and then feeding it to an experienced sales executive, um, or even better, a steering group of people who come from different backgrounds and different levels of
Yeah.
experience, different markets, different degrees of training and backgrounds, and all of this. that broad church there with the diversity of thought will be an excellent way to process the output from the AI and then figure out what are the significant opportunities to take forward. So I think it's going to be, I think AI will serve the sales community better than it'll serve the intelligence community, where decisions are safety critical. Um, but I think it may well be on a par with the benefit it's brought to the medical community, where uh, systems can detect indications of tumors and stuff even better than an expert human.
Yeah. Yeah. No, for sure. In sales, there's an explosion of different sort of AI technologies coming out now, which that's interesting, which is overwhelming. And so much of it is to do with the quality of the prompting and the questions and the uh, and that's a skill. I was involved in a project recently where we were asked to develop a complex case study, for a client based on an old case study of an automotive organization. And it was very tech focused, and they wanted us to kind of make it much more business focused. Um, and it's interesting with the kind of prompting that we have through the mindsets that are written about in the book and everything else. Using some of those tools, you're able to actually use AI to get a really, really interesting set of information about a quote fictitious client in the automotive sector faced with, sort of global challenges. Um, the case study up to a really sophisticated level. But what I think struck me is that the tools with which to build the case study were available, to anyone. The tech company could have done it themselves, but they lacked the confidence and the insight to be able to ask the intelligent questions, then to disseminate the information from the data that came on from the AI kind of searching for information. So, yeah, in this instance, at this point in time, the human operator of AI is still playing an important role
Yeah.
in how you might leverage AI to get the information that you need. And back to your point right at the very beginning, which is, I suppose this is to do with bias and autobiographical listening, is that, what you get out of something is going to be based on sort of what you put into it. And um, knowing what biases might exist in your own mind as you approach a particular problem is going to help you maybe ask questions you wouldn't normally ask because yeah, and
Yeah.
it's really, really important, I think, part of the intelligence gathering process. It doesn't start with what's out there, it starts with what's in your head and how you get your head in a place that allows you to actually manage information in a great way.
Yes, I mean that we're not information poor, and I think that we all face that issue of selection and prioritization. And I think it's incumbent upon the sales community, particularly, to understand how to use a very, very huge reservoir of useful information and irrelevant information as well, in order to support their clients' problem solving methods. Because as soon as you start working towards a mutual solution, then you tend to be working on an adult to adult basis. And that's a cooperation. That's something that in my experience, buyers are grateful for, and I guess sellers as well. And I think if we look at it over a period of time and we consider problem solving to be a continuous process, a kind of partnership between a
Yes.
trusted buyer and a client, reflecting again some of the examples in the book, then you can see that it's sensible for the buyer and the seller to share a process of consolidation where you might have, for example, derived from a mature sales community, a kind of a body of knowledge,
Yes.
which is entered by AI analytical methods,
Yeah.
which could be fed into something like a playbook, And I say that it would need to be something that would be approved at sales director level, but this would be um, the things that you should and shouldn't do. So it's clear how salespersons should be able to behave, say how much versatility or agility they have, what's acceptable lines to take, and so forth. And this feeds into conducting a sales operation, which is fundamentally really probably cooperative exercise with the client.
Yeah. So interesting how you refer back to transactional analysis quite a lot
Yeah,
and your sort of
yeah,
background. And just it's quite interesting. We've done many sort of TA um, self-analysis exercises within the sales community. And I would say broadly, our findings are strong parent, strong child, and quite a low adult. And it so what you suggest is this adult conversation taking place. I think for many, they would find that quite difficult because they do have a dominant, controlling parent, which may influence the way they like
mm,
to control the sales conversation, and they have that manipulative child that may sort of deal with the exaggeration, perhaps to a larger extent.
indeed.
So so having a sort of conscious or having frameworks or tools that can help you sort of get to that adult relationship is something that we try and develop on the training programs, for example, that we
Yeah,
run.
absolutely. That makes. I mean, I think also within the play, if you do have a playbook uh, and evolved however it suits the community, um, it will be clear if someone's if a salesperson is exhibiting behaviour that doesn't fit in, it'll become much more obvious than if they're just allowed generally to do their thing on the hope that they'll make some sales. So I think it's a good handrail, and it allows you to have feedback loops as well, so you can
Yeah,
understand how to capitalize on wins, how to avoid chronic mistakes,
yeah,
um, and how to evolve people. I also think that salespersons are possibly more focused on the fact that they're competing with other companies
yeah,
than the buyer is. The buyer doesn't actually care about competition insofar they care insofar as they'll probably get the best deal available from
yeah,
different. But the issue of competition otherwise is moot.
yeah,
So that can drive a different behavior in the seller to what the buyer actually would prefer.
yeah,
And I think that's again that partly comes from the TA thing. Um, I think also it's a strong behavioural thing, and it does require a significant amount of reflexive thinking. But I think because sales is a because it is fundamentally competitive at the end of the day. If you can achieve advantage by reflection,
yeah,
um, you can consolidate that with feedback loops feeding into the body of
yeah.
knowledge. Then you're probably on a winner.
Can I ask you a question about sort of
Hmm.
intelligence analysts? You mentioned them before, and how they've got so much data they have to kind of sift through. What qualities do you think are that makes a great intelligence? I don't know if analyst is the right word or an intelligence person. What skills would they have that make them really good at what they do?
Without doubt, a huge amount of patience with their own clients. So an intelligence analyst will have multimedia streams of information coming in 24/7, and they are expected to generate intelligence summaries for the senior decision makers, um, and they have a finite time to do this. Obviously, information has most of it has a good best before date. Um, uh, the problem they face is they need to be as to their analysis to be as comprehensive and complete and wide as possible, but at the same time it needs to be understood in a short amount of time by someone who's very busy, and matching that input to output demand is a significant problem. So it can be quite unsatisfying gaining a view of a situation and then having to stop before you feel you've really um, understood the essence of the problem, and you've got to report in language which somebody um, who is less of an expert in the area than you are will understand.
Yeah.
On to the next thing. So it requires a lot of patience to be able to deal with the intelligence customer.
Yeah.
And this came out of the Butler report, particularly, which is what I base a lot of my work on. If you've got lots of information, it's all the right information, how can you then make the wrong decision? Well, the process was driven by the client who was demanding information.
Yeah.
All of saying, don't give me that, maybe this, maybe the other. Will it or won't it?
Yeah.
Of course, the intelligence analyst, their job is to tell the truth, not to say what their client wants to hear.
Right.
Senior and fundamentally bullied the analyst into something which the client wanted to hear, but wasn't fundamentally true. So there was again an awkward power relationship in there, which skewed the whole process.
You're just giving me a whole sort of another sort of train of thought, which is around the relationship of salespeople with their sales managers. Because typically what would
Mm,
happen is the managers are under huge pressure to achieve quarter end kind of results. They may be managing a team of 20, 30 people. Those managers then have to report to the board, on how much business they're going to be able to close this next quarter, because it's get fed through into quarter end, sometimes PLC type announcements. And there's a huge amount of time and activity goes into the process of briefing. Up to, you can imagine, you start off with a salesperson and a sales manager, then a regional sales manager, then a national sales manager,
mm,
then maybe up to the CEO kind of level. And there's so much time is spent, and the difference between what we think is going to come in the next quarter, what we hope will come in the next quarter,
mm.
what are we going to, and the difference between what we are going to commit to versus what our stretch goal might be. So this kind of pressure you often see um, coming through coming through the system. Your conversation about power is quite interesting here, wanting to give the managers the data that will make them look good when they are presenting to their managers,
Indeed.
and how
Yeah.
you might inflate or skew, the way in which you talk about a particular deal. It's really quite a complicated process. And if you it has a ripple effect of not only you get salespeople withholding deals sometimes that they don't want to talk about because they know it'll come under high scrutiny, by the powers that be. But it's something they can pull out of the bag, at short notice if it comes through and then it's good. And they don't want to get too much interference from senior management in that particular deal. But it goes down to a sort of game that the salespeople play with the managers, but it's also something that can affect, in a negative way, conversations with customers, because if there's so much pressure being put on positive or negative intelligence going up to management about how much we predict we're going to do by the
Yeah.
end of the quarter, that it can influence perhaps slightly unscrupulous, manipulative activities going on with the customer, in order to try and get a deal across the line.
Yes.
It's just really interesting. You talk about the ethics of exaggeration. You've got the ethics of actually not telling any,
Yeah.
something
And
completely hidden. so, so it's the opposite.
if I know something and I don't tell you, is that strictly deception?
Yeah.
It's a tough call. And I think also management are frequently seduced into measuring what's easy to measure rather than what's valuable. So if I was a management accountant, I'd be very much concerned with time and money.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're making sales, in an ideal world, you would be trusted to get the best for the company over a longer period of time. And this could be several years, or it could even be several decades. But it's really difficult to measure goodness. It's really easy to measure how many hours you put into something or how much, you've got per quarter or something.
Yeah.
So, when I talk about measuring time and money, time could be measured in hours you sell to the client, or if you've got per quarter or per F. Um, the the goodness part of that triangle, that's it's treated. I think value is treated as very much as a blunt instrument. The higher you go up a hierarchy,
Yeah.
um, and I think that one of the problems that I've seen is, and again, I think it reflects some of our earlier conversations, is that of trust flowing up and down. Um, if a company could work with its salespeople and allow them to reflect and play a much longer game,
Yeah.
then that would be supremely useful. So it's a little bit like if you're playing pool. If you're and I'm really bad at pool, but and almost always when I play, I make the white ball end up going
Okay.
shares. So I then allow my opponent to play two shots.
Yeah.
Um, if they're drunk enough, they forget they've got two, and they do one. They get a ball in or not, or perhaps it leaves the table, and then go, "Oh, I've got another one, haven't I?" It's a very different situation. If you were sober and you realised that you could set up something which is much better by playing these two shots, the first shot, in a sense, would be preparatory, and the
Yeah.
second, the reward.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a different way of treating your sequential activity.
Yeah.
If people would trust their sales force to be able to undertake sequential activities without a known end time,
Yeah.
but which had a high probability of success if they were allowed to invest
Yeah.
in a series of activities that may or may not cross a financial year boundary, then that would actually generate more revenue for the company in the longer term. So it depends what your integration time is. If you're dealing on a by quarter basis, you'll always be playing the short game.
Yeah.
And it's just not worth it. And a political sort of example of this is Xi Jinping is able to think maybe some years ago, able to plan about a 30-year
Yeah.
strategy. Whereas in the Western democracies, we have, terms of 3 or 4 years or whatever. And really, it's not worth your while trying to gain a benefit in 20 years if it's going to make you unpopular and then voted out at the next election.
Yeah.
So again, we're forced into playing a shorter game, and
Yeah.
there's no opportunity to have a series of related sequential activities that consolidate and allow better decision making and better actions and more latitude downstream. So if a company was to trust its sales director to operate across financial years, then I think that they would be able to implement some much more interesting longer term plans, including things like influence and information operations, which would not be perfidious. There would no need for deception or anything like that, but they would consolidate the company's position as a whole. It would provide latitude downstream and all sorts of fallback options and contingencies. And it would be worthwhile doing. I think it would engage the sales force more as well, because salespeople are, they do undertake operations in the same way, not an identical way to operations in defense or national security, but they broadly have the same operational structure. And you would undertake an operational analysis in the same way. You'd think about the strategic and the near-term objectives, stretch targets and hard targets.
Yeah.
You would be thinking about how you get the outcome you want, which shouldn't be tied to a short-term metric like which quarter it falls in.
Yeah.
But it does mean that the sales director has to argue to the board that there should be latitude for his or her staff to be able to reflect on how to do Do good thinking, not just fast thinking.
Sounds like the title of a book. Good thinking, not fast thinking.
I think it's something almost identical
Yeah,
may have been.
yeah,
Right.
Daniel Kahneman's book. Yeah,
Yes,
think
yeah,
slow, think fast. I think it all think fast, think
yeah.
slow. Yeah, which is amazing. Well, look, I think we're getting towards the end of our conversation here, Jas. Is there anything that you feel that we haven't talked about that you think would be quite interesting from your point of view?
I think we've covered most of the things I was thinking about. I was struck by um, the commonality of topics in your book and in our earlier conversations with what I've been doing recently, supporting government in some of their more complex endeavours. I think there's a lot of read across. What I'd really like to do would be to keep focus on this, but working with you, your colleagues, and your students. And for all of us in that community to share the ideas, because as I said before, we all take we've got different perspectives. If we can find some way to generate a useful body of knowledge for the community, um, then I think that'd be an amazing resource. Of course, there'll be some commercial barriers in there
Yeah,
and so. But I think methodologically, um, I think that if we treat sales as a series of linked operations over time,
yeah,
I think that'll give it the value it deserves, rather than treating salespeople as a product that needs to return revenue in short term and short order. I think that's an enterprise worth continuing. Um, there's a whole bunch of things, of course, that we have managed to cover in this, for all sorts of reasons. But the commonality is extraordinary to me. I'm really looking forward to working with you and your colleagues.
yeah. Well, likewise. And I just want to thank you, Jas, for coming on the podcast. It's been amazing. And yes, I think our students are going to look forward to having the chance to meet you at some point and learning about the dark arts of communication and strategy. Well, it's not really a dark art, but, done in an ethical way, of course,
Absolutely, yeah, no, definitely.
and to have some
Uh,
fun with it.
Enjoyed it thoroughly. I look forward to working with you and friends.
Yeah. Thank you.